Morning, Pa. Part 2, The Missing Stories. I'm looking forward to this section. All right. Here we go. Chapter 6, Reconstructing the Lost Manuscript. The structure for the Book of Mormon anticipated by Joseph Smith and his scribes changed as the book's text unfolded across the translation process. What likely began with a simple third-person narrative found early in the translation became increasingly complex as it began to include various narrative forms. This change in style is perhaps best exemplified by the third-person narration of the lost manuscript being replaced with the first-person accounts by Nephi, Jacob, and Jacob's descendants, a style similar to the writings of the Book of Mormon's final two authors, Mormon and Moroni. This radical and fundamental change to the book's initial structure, caused by the insertion of the manuscript's small plates replacement, was necessitated by the manuscript's theft. By better understanding this change, we can also have a better understanding of what it was changing from. The small plates as a replacement solution. Joseph's short-term response to the manuscript's theft was to continue the dictating the Book of Mormon narrative where he had left off in the early part of the Book of Mosiah. Several weeks into this work, Joseph received a revelation that sidestepped possible snares awaiting him from the thieves and solved both the problems that would arise from reproducing the stolen manuscript and those that would arise from not reproducing it. Addressing Joseph, the revelation commanded him to not translate again those words which have gone forth out of your hands. That's Doctrine and Covenants 30. The rationale for this forbearance was that Joseph's enemies were not only intending to use the stolen manuscript to test his abilities as a translator, they were also intending to rig the supposed test against him by altering the manuscript. Rather than a test, this was a trap. If Joseph was unable to exactly reproduce the translation, a feat that would be difficult if, as suggested by Doctrine and Covenants 9, 8-9, Joseph had to study out the exact wording of the text, then they could have used the stolen manuscript to point this out against him. If Joseph was able to reproduce the translation exactly, then by altering the text, they could claim that he was unable to do so. Revelation handily solved this problem of not reproducing the stolen text by instructing Joseph to replace it with another account covering the same time period. This replacement text would be the accounts in the plates of Nephi. That's Doctrine and Covenants 10, 38-45. While Joseph had previously encountered the term plates of Nephi during the translation process, it had been there referred to the source behind the lost manuscript and the rest of Mormon's abridgment. That's Mosiah 1:6, Alma 37:2, Alma 44:24, Mormon 1:4. It was not until Joseph began dictating the lost manuscript's plates of Nephi, that it became clear that these plates of Nephi were not the ones mentioned in the earlier manuscript. The replacement text identifies itself as a record engraved on plates of Nephi, 1 Nephi 9:2, but distinguishes these from the other plates of Nephi, those that served as the source of Mormon's abridgment. That's Mormon 1:4. The plates of Nephi, or record of the people of Nephi, from which the title page indicates Mormon abridged his work, including the lost manuscript, are described as a vast, near-comprehensive record of Nephite history. The other plates of Nephi, those that replace the lost manuscript, are described by Mormon as a small account of the prophets from Jacob down to the reign of this King Benjamin, and also many of the word of Nephi. See Words of Mormon 1:3. The designated as small plates by Jacob, the second author to write on them. That's Jacob 1:1-2. Footnote says, the use of the large plates and small plates terminology evolved out of Jacob's reference to the plates of Nephi, translated as 1 Nephi through the Words of Mormon, as the small plates upon which these things are engraven, and to the plates of Nephi containing the more detailed, non-extant account as the larger plates. That's Jacob 1:1 and Jacob 3:13. Within its text, the small plates record's existence is represented as a divine providence, with Nephi averring that the Lord hath commanded me to make these plates for a wise purpose in him, which purpose I know not. That's 1 Nephi 9:5. The account's purpose, while unknown to its narrators, is evident to historically informed readers. It was to fill the gap left by this lost manuscript. With the revelation saying the lost text was abridged from the large plates of Nephi, it expressly commanded Joseph to not translate again those words which have gone forth from your hands, in order to not bring forth the same words again. Doctrine and Covenants 10:17 and 30. Thus, Joseph's ability to instead translate the small plates account enabled him to fill the gap left by the lost manuscript without violating the Revelation's injunction. Mormon's segue. The loss of the initial manuscript, a consequent substitution of the small plates, changed the complicated Book of Mormon's structure. Though the book's title page pronounces it the Book of Mormon, written by the hand of Mormon, the content that immediately follows the title page, the first book of Nephi, is introduced with the explanation, I, Nephi, wrote this record. This switch between narrators necessitated Joseph adding a preface to the initial publication to preempt any confusion this discrepancy might bring to the readers. See Chapter 5, because he went over that kind of information. In addition to this change of narrators between the title page and Nephi's introduction in his opening book, another explanation or bridge was required between the first-person accounts in the Book of Omni and the resumption of Mormon's third-person abridgment in the Book of Mosiah. It is between these two books that Mormon, mentioned on the title page, finally makes his appearance in the text. In the Words of Mormon, he explains why he spliced the intrusive small plates into his record, though he had already presented a now lost narrative of the same period, covering by the small plates in his abridgment. Mormon found the small plates pleasing because they included detailed prophecies of Christ, suggesting that such prophecies had been subtler or less evident in their earlier lost manuscript narrative. See Words of Mormon 1:4. Mormon's explanation of why he included the small plates with his record also hints at the kind of providence that had led Nephi to create the small plates in the first place. Quote, I do this for a wise purpose. Thus it whispereth me, according to the workings of the Spirit of the Lord which is in me. And now I do not know all things, but the Lord knoweth all things, which are to come. Wherefore he worketh in me to do according to his will. That's Words of Mormon 6. Then he concludes his words with a recap of the narrative about King Benjamin that he had provided in the original, now lost chapters 1 and 2 of the Book of Mosiah. And now I, Mormon, proceed to finish out my record, which I take from the plates of Nephi, and I make it according to the knowledge and understanding which God has given me. That's Words of Mormon, verse 9. In doing so, Mormon bridges from the very brief small plates, synopsis of Mosiah's the first reign, and Benjamin's early reign in our Mosiah 1:1. Footnote says, this bridging function is also filled less overtly by Amaleki's conclusion to the Book of Omni, which immediately precedes Mormon's words. Amaleki covers Benjamin's early reign, summarizing the same incidents of military and spiritual conflict that Mormon covers after him. See Omni, chapter 1, 23 through 25. Mormon thus oddly duplicates Omni's narrative bridge to Mosiah. While somewhat redundant, the duplication creates for the reader a more immediate narrative continuity between the small plates and Mormon's abridgment. Mormon's source for his abridgment. The revelation instructing Joseph Smith on how to proceed with the translation informs us that the lost narrative was taken from a detailed Nephite record inaugurated by Nephi himself. It reminds its early audience members who were familiar with the lost manuscript's content that the manuscript mentioned this more detailed source. Quote, "And now verily I say unto you, that an account of those things that you have written, which have gone out of your hands, is engraven upon the plates of Nephi. Yea, and you remember it was said in those writings that a more particular account was given of these things upon the plates of Nephi." Doctrine and Covenants 10, 38 through 39. The manuscript thieves of the Revelation adds, "have only got a part or an abridgment of the account of Nephi." Verse 44. As discussed earlier, attempting to map all references to the plates of Nephi in this revelation onto the plates of Nephi discussed in the Book of Mormon can produce confusion. Read in light of the subsequently dictated Book of Mormon texts, the revelation seems ambiguous regarding which plates of Nephi it was instructing Joseph to translate in order to fill the gap created by the manuscript theft. Despite the ambiguity, it clearly identified which account the lost narrative was based on by reminding its original audience that the lost text identified its source as the more particular account, i.e. the fuller, more detailed account of Nephi history, that is, Nephi's large plates. Characteristics of the large plates account. Doctrine and Covenants 10 describes the narrative in the lost manuscript as an abridgment of the large plates of Nephi. According to Noah Webster's contemporaneous American Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1828, the same year Joseph Smith dictated and lost the initial Book of Mormon manuscript, to abridge was to make shorter, to epitomize, to contract by using fewer words, yet retaining the sense in substance. Thus, according to the Revelation, the lost narrative that Joseph translated from the golden plates was a condensed version of the narrative contained in Nephi's large plates, offering fewer words and minutiae, but with the same essential narrative substance. In short, the large plates were not the golden plates that Joseph translated. They were the source of Mormon's abridgment that he engraved onto the plates in Joseph's possession. As the source for the abridgment, the characteristics ascribed to the large plates should similarly describe the lost narrative, including the perspective and concerns of the kings or those which they caused to be written. Jerem 1:14. Filtered through the prophetic perspective of the editor-narrator Mormon, representing an abridged record of Nephi's dynasty, the lost narrative would adopt that dynasty's point of view. Footnote: the phrase, "which they caused to be written," suggests that the king sometimes dictated what was to be written onto the large plates. Similar phrasing is used to describe Joseph Smith's process of dictating the Book of Mormon translation to his scribes in Doctrine and Covenants 10:11. Benjamin dictating his sermon to scribes, who then spread the written text to others, Mosiah 2:9, and Nephi having his brother Jacob's sermon recorded in 2 Nephi 11:1. The small plates of Nephi, an account that Joseph Smith translated to fill the lost manuscript gap, describes the large plates mostly in contrast to the small plates themselves. While Nephi does not distinguish the two sets of the plates by name, calling both simply the plates of Nephi, he does distinguish them by purpose. Nephi says that the small plates are not the plates upon which I make a full account of the history of my people. That's 1 Nephi 9:2. Thus, although he titles his first small plates accounts the first book of Nephi, his reign and ministry, he soon makes clear that the record is to focus more on the ministry and the prophecies. That's verse 3. And footnote for that says, Nephi's statement that the small plates' ministerial purpose was revealed to him only after he had made them, and may be intended to explain why he gave his record the somewhat misleading title, The Book of Nephi, His Reign and Ministry. That makes sense to me. Accordingly, he offers very little about his reign. It and the subsequent reign of the kings and the wars and contentions of my people, verses 2 through 4, Nephi distinguished his small plates' ministerial record from his comprehensive large plates record in how he describes the small plates, what he recorded on the small plates, and what he commanded his brother Jacob to record on the small plates. The small plates were to skimp on history, that is, on narrative, and incorporate primarily preaching and prophecy. Nephi gave me, Jacob, a commandment concerning the small plates, that I should not touch, save it were lightly, concerning the history of this people. For he said that the history of his people should be engraven on his other plates, and if there were preaching, which was sacred, or revelation, which was great, or prophesying, that I should engraven the heads of them upon these plates, and touch upon them as much as it were possible. Jacob 1, 2 through 4. Continuing to draw contrasts, Nephi distinguishes the record of his ministerial highlights in the small plates from the detailed record of his life and his nation in the large plates. He thus writes in his small account that he had written a more history part on his other plates, so that if readers desire to know more particular part of the history of my people, they must search mine other larger plates. That's 2 Nephi 4:14 and chapter 5:33. It was on those, Nephi says, that he engraved many of his and his father's teachings. See 2 Nephi 4:14. And also the records of my father, and also our journeyings in the wilderness, and the prophecies of my father, and also many of mine own prophecies. 1 Nephi 19:1. They also contain the genealogy of Lehi's fathers, and the more part of all our proceedings in the wilderness. That's verse 2. So the things which are transpired before Nephi made the small plates and began building a ship. In other words, most of Lehi's narrative and all of his wilderness exodus are of a truth more particularly made mention upon the first larger plates. That's in verse 2 of 1 Nephi chapter 19. Nephi, however, is careful to not to distinguish these records too sharply, lest the reader conclude that the subject matter of the small plates is sacred, while that of the larger plates is secular. He clarifies, I do not write anything upon the plates, save it be that I think be sacred. That's 1 Nephi 19:6. The small plates skimp on narrative, conveying primarily prophecy, doctrinal exposition, and biblical quotations. The large plates, like the narrative books of the Hebrew Bible, provide primarily sacred history. In short, rather than the distinction between the small plates and the large plates being one of a spiritual account and the other of a secular account, the two are more akin to the distinct genres of scripture in the Hebrew Bible. The large plates share a similarity to the historical books such as Kings and Chronicles, whereas the small plates, which contain this small account of the this small account of the prophets, that's Words of Mormon 1:3, share a similarity to those histories contemporaneous prophetic books such as Isaiah and Jeremiah. Mormon's abridgment in the lost manuscript did not so much zero in on highlights as try to tell a complete story of Lehi and the early Nephites and God's dealings with them. Less detailed than the large plates account it undertakes to abridge, and not as focused on discourse and prophecy as the small plates, the lost manuscript offered a more holistic account of Nephite history, filling its pages with Nephites' encounters with God, with the Lamanites, and with one another. Implications from Joseph Smith's Preface. As discussed in Chapter 5, in order to avoid confusing the reader, Joseph Smith oversimplified his description of the lost pages in his preface to the first printing of the Book of Mormon, though imprecise his writing that they consisted of 116 pages, the which I took from the Book of Lehi, which was from an account abridged from the plates of Lehi by the hand of Mormon, nevertheless sheds light on some of the lost narrative's content. Joseph writes in his preface that the lost narrative was, like most of the extant text that followed, an abridgment by the hand of Mormon. This continues in narrator identity and presentation, i.e., as an abridgment of the larger records, and suggests that the lost narrative was stylistically similar to Mormon's continued abridgment found in Mosiah through 4th Nephi. Like the latter, the lost manuscript would have been narrated in the third person, one that was presumably anonymous, with Mormon seeming to wait to introduce himself until his work of abridgment is nearing completion by telling the readers, "Behold, I am called Mormon." That's 3 Nephi, chapter 5, verse 12. Now, as discussed above, the large plates, and thus Mormon's abridgment, may have been modeled on that of the historical books of the Bible, like Exodus 1 and 2 Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are anonymously narrated. If so, the original extant was likely to have the book be anonymously narrated until the reader reaches the narrator's own day, i.e., Mormon's life. This would account for why Mormon introduces himself so late in the narration. However, given Mormon's tendency to comment on the stories he was abridging, he may have felt it necessary to introduce himself earlier than planned. In the lost manuscript, the lost manuscript contrasts with first-person narration in the small plates accounts, beginning in the voice of Nephi, whose account is told from the perspective of the second generation of Lehi's family, and centers its attention there. Thus Nephi tells in detail how he received for himself a version of God's covenant with his father Lehi. That's 1 Nephi chapter 2, 16 through 24, but never provides the narrative of how Lehi had received the covenant in the first place. To the extent that Lehi's story is told in this account, it is first filtered through Nephi's perspective. Mormon's narration at the beginning of the lost manuscript almost certainly gave greater attention to Lehi's experiences than Nephi does in his small plates account, and provided a narration that made use of both of their perspectives. Joseph's use of the terms Book of Lehi and Plates of Lehi in his preface, though inadequate in characterizing the lost manuscript as a whole, tells us something about how the narration therein opened. While Joseph stretched this term by using it as a label for the entire lost manuscript, he almost certainly did not simply create the name for the preface. The lost manuscript evidently began with the Book of Lehi, suggesting that it centralized Lehi more than Nephi. This Book of Lehi, in turn, represented material abridged from Nephi's detailed large plates account that may have included Lehi's personal record. See S. Kent Brown, Lehi's Personal Record, Quest for the Missing Source. Thus, the kind of detail regarding Lehi that Nephi says he is not including from his father record, his earliest dreams and visions, that's 1 Nephi 1:16, his genealogy, that's chapter 6, verse 1, the details of his exodus, that's verse 3, very, very likely were included in the lost manuscript. So, sorry, just a second. There it is. So we're starting to get what he's finding as, here's the lost material. And so the Book of Lehi, that we know the specific stories that are missing because they're mentioned, are going to be his more detailed dreams and visions, and his genealogy, and the details of his exodus. Although we actually do get some of that, but it's very abridged in the plates of Nephi that we have, like in the record that's in the Book of Mormon at this point, because Nephi basically, if I remember his genealogy, says, it suffices me to say that we're definitely from the lineage of Joseph. And so it's mentioned in there, and also we know of his dreams, because Nephi talks about Lehi's particular dreams where he had the pillar of fire next to him, that he had to go and preach. So I suspect it has more to do with the stuff really before the Exodus. I know the biggest dream that Lehi and Nephi shared is the Tree of Life dream. So, cool. Hopefully he'll go into that more. Section heading is the Hebraic Lost Manuscript. Let me check something here. Oh yeah, we got lots of smaller subsections. Heck, I could probably finish this chapter. Nice. The Hebraic Lost Manuscript. One indication of what was in the Lost Book of Mormon manuscript is the impact that the manuscript had on the earliest Latter-day Saints who interacted with it. When those involved in the translation of this manuscript made statements about the lost pages before the rest of the Book of Mormon was translated, those statements should reflect the lost content. Significantly, at the time Joseph Smith and Martin Harris worked on the translation, persons in conversation with them at the time recount hearing them characterize the book and its purpose in surprisingly Hebraic terms. The first of these accounts, one of the earliest affidavits, commenting on Joseph Smith and the restoration, reports Joseph's own characterization of his prophetic mission during this time. According to this account, Joseph understood his role at the time to be one of restoring Israel through the gathering of the Jews rather than the restoration of the Church of Christ. The affidavit was published in 1834 and sworn by Hezekiah McCune, a Harmony, Pennsylvania neighbor to the Saints and an in-law of Emma. Sometime in the months after his arrival in Harmony near the end of 1827, Joseph is said to have described his divine mission by claiming to be a prophet sent by God to bring in the Jews. Footnote says, Hezekiah McCune, statement, March 20th, 1834, in Vogel. McCune was married to Elizabeth Lewis, daughter of Emma's maternal uncle, Nathaniel Lewis. Married to Elizabeth Lewis, daughter of Emma's maternal uncle, Nathaniel Lewis. Cool. He was also son of Joseph McCune, Sr., whose property adjoined Joseph and Emma's. McCune does not date his conversation with Joseph Smith, but a lasting alienation occurs between Joseph and the Lewises in mid-1828, places the conversation around early 1828. In line with this reported Hebraic emphasis in Joseph Smith's prophetic consciousness in early 1828, Martin Harris is said to have characterized the Book of Mormon's purpose more in Old Testament terms than in New Testament terms. Report of this comes to us from John H. Gilbert, a Palmyra resident and friend of Martin Harris, who became the typesetter for the 1830 Book of Mormon. Although recalling the communication with Martin just over 5 decades later, other verifiable aspects of his recollection, such as his description of the Book of Mormon manuscripts that he had not seen for a half-century at the time of his testimony, confirm his memories to a fine level of detail. On the accuracy of Gilbert's memories of the Book of Mormon manuscripts, see Royal Skousen, Worthy of Another Look, John Gilbert's 1892 account of the 1830 printing of the Book of Mormon. He writes, speaking about, I suppose, John Gilbert, yes, he writes, quote, late in 1827 or early 28 was the first I heard Harris speak of Joe's finding the plates. The plates, as represented at the time, purported to be a history of our lost tribes of Israel, and not establishing a new religion, but confirming the Old Testament, unquote. Source for that is John H. Gilbert to James T. Cobb, February 10th, 1879. Although the account's broad strokes description of the Book of Mormon as a story of lost tribes of Israel was common, even among non-Mormons well acquainted with the book's contents, his dating of the conversation with Martin as occurring late 1827 or early 1828 would have placed it at a time when Martin could have only had knowledge of the contents of the Lost Pages portion of the Book of Mormon and nothing beyond it. Martin's description of the Book of Mormon's earliest text would be puzzling if applied to its later published text. While the latter includes many Old Testament elements, such as the making of covenants, the exodus to the Promised Land, and the building of a temple, it foregrounds at least many numerous New Testament elements, including angelic annunciation of Christ's future birth, the institution of baptism and establishment of a church, Pauline-style missionary work, a new star given as a sign of Christ's birth, post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, a version of the sermon, I think you forgot on, Sermon the Mount, so I think it's Sermon on the Mount, and quasi-Pauline epistles on baptism and on faith, hope, and charity. The completed book, as it would emerge from the 1829 translation effort, was explicit in teaching Jesus Christ by name and provided a model and detailed plans for a latter-day church built along primitive Christian lines. Based on these accounts, the two persons primarily engaged in the translation of the Lost Pages saw the book's mission and their mission in bringing it forth in profoundly Hebraic terms. The book, as they knew it up to this point, had not so much discussed restoring the New Testament church as it had discussed confirming and fulfilling the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible and restoring Jewish nationhood. As will be seen in the remaining chapters, the lost manuscripts focus on Nephi's multiple connections to Joseph of Egypt, building a tabernacle and later a temple that was modeled on those of Moses and Solomon, dividing Lehi's descendants into tribes, establishing a priesthood alternative to that of Aaron's, and many other details, all confirm the Hebraic emphasis described by McCune and Gilbert. In other words, Joseph and Martin described the book they were then translating in such profoundly Hebraic terms because the material they were translating was so profoundly Hebraic, paralleling, extending, and culminating in a new promised land, the saga of Israel. Undoing the exile, recreating Israel in the New World. The narrative of the Book of Mormon's lost manuscript begins within that of the Hebrew Bible, recapitulating the saga of Israel and extending it into the New World. Its foundational book of Lehi, narratives of Lehi's family fleeing Jerusalem and of Nephi establishing a kingdom in a new Jerusalem, introduced the Hebraic themes of covenant, promised land, exile, and restoration that pervade both the book and the faith that emerged from it. These accounts comprise the narrative bedrock of the Book of Mormon and an important historical foundation for the restoration. In their overarching narrative, Lehi and Nephi suffer the loss of the Israelite world they had known and seek to rebuild it. Lehi's story begins in Jerusalem, soon after the reign of the reformist Josiah, in the biblical narratives of Jeremiah, who prophesied of the Jews' exile and the end of David's dynasty. Lehi had a vision and promptly joined with Jeremiah and other prophets, warning Jerusalem of pending exile and destruction. He, like Jeremiah, was rejected and his life threatened, yet being warned that the Judean land of promise was soon to become a land of bondage, as Egypt had been for his forebears, Lehi fled to the wilderness. Lehi's exile was well-timed, with his calling vision occurring in the commencement of the first year of the reign of Zedekiah. Sorry, let me check if I missed any. Nope, no footnotes I missed. Okay. That's 1 Nephi 1:4 for that reference. In view of how Zedekiah's reign began, detailed in the next chapter, this places Lehi's vision in the immediate wake or evening during a Babylonian invasion that installed Zedekiah as king and began the first wave of the Babylonian exile. Lehi's exodus thus occurred immediately after Nebuchadnezzar II's armies plundered the temple, leaving worshippers without their literal touchstones with deity, the divinely inscribed tablets of the Ark of the Covenant, and without their other touchstones with God, the Urim and Thummim. Footnote 11 says, the loss of the Urim and Thummim is indicated by Ezra, chapter 2, verse 63, and Nehemiah's chapter 7, verse 65. The Ark of the Covenant would have disappeared from the temple no later than Nebuchadnezzar's earlier capture of Jerusalem when he installed Zedekiah, in which he stripped the temple of its golden treasure. See 2 Kings 24:13. The ark's fate is not definitely known. Rabbinical lore says Josiah hid the ark, and the apocryphal 2 Maccabees says it was hidden by Jeremiah. Which is interesting because if you ask a lot of regular Christians, I think their explanation for the ark is that it's, carried up by an angel. So, interesting. Maybe it's in a warehouse somewhere, according to Indiana Jones. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar's II armies carried the previous king and many of Jerusalem's notables in bondage to Babylon, a small beginning to a vast exile. During this time, Lehi abandoned Jerusalem in anticipation of the emperor's final invasion and the world-shattering changes it would bring for Jews and Judaism, the destruction of the First Temple, the abolition of the Davidic monarchy by the capture of Zedekiah and execution of his sons, and the exile of much of the population to Babylon. The generation of Jews after the Babylonian captivity inherited the fractured world of the diaspora, never restoring the pristine wholeness of living in a single body, ruled by the house of David, and worshipping in a temple with the ark and its sacred memorials of the Exodus. Lehi's band escaped this forced exile to Babylon only by undertaking voluntary exile in the wilderness. They endured most of the losses that characterized the exile, with the additional loss of the biblical high priest and the Aaronite priests. Thus, the Book of Mormon exiles, no less than the biblical exiles, were dispossessed of their inherited land, the temple, the divine presence embodied in their sacred relics and enshrined in the Ark of the Covenant, and the sacred rule of the Davidic dynasty. They became wanderers, cast out from Jerusalem. That's Jacob 7:26? JAC 7:26. The last pages open with the Book of Lehi's account of their exile, and much of its action is motivated by the problem of such an exile, the loss of the institutions of the Jewish commonwealth. Yet, although the Nephites suffered the same loss of religious and political center as the Babylonian exiles, their interpretation and consequent response differed dramatically. Instead of an exile, their journey became an exodus to a new promised land, the birth of a new Israelite nation. Nephi preserves his people's Israelite identity by establishing institutions like those he knew in the pre-exilic Israelite commonwealth. Despite that commonwealth's destruction, his people were not long bereft of sacred city, temple, relics embodying God's presence, instruments of revelation, and a divinely chosen king. With Lehi as their Moses, they found a new promised land. Under Nephi, they built a new Jerusalem, and in a temple where they housed the memorials of their exodus and resumed sacrifice to Israel's God. Most of the clues of the Book of Lehi's contents cluster around this central theme of founding a new nation of Israel and restoring what had been lost as a result of exile. As will become evident in the various bits of the lost manuscript we will identify, it delineated more overtly than the extant account how Lehi and Nephi's lives echo the major events of the founding of Israel. The unifying theme of the Lehi and Nephi narratives is the establishment of a new Israelite nation, modeled on the establishment of the biblical Israelite nation. The Lehi and Nephi chapters of this book thus have an overarching thesis. In the book of Lehi's accounts of Lehi and Nephi, they countered their loss of the Commonwealth of Israel in the Old World by constructing a smaller but structurally parallel Commonwealth of Joseph in the New World. Lehi and Nephi recreate in microcosm the Israel they left behind. Their story thus recapitulates the biblical story of Israel's founding. The stories in these chapters will accordingly be organized around key biblically modeled events in the establishment of the Nephite Commonwealth, division into tribes, Exodus, inaugurating worship in a tabernacle, conquest of the Promised Land, founding a dynasty, and building a temple. Footnote: the ordering of the elements, though similar to that of the Bible, is not identical, and it is difficult to order precisely, since the beginning of each of these processes may long precede its culmination. Reconstructing the missing stories. Given the likely size of the lost manuscript from at least 116 pages to as many as 200 to 300 pages, it goes without saying that many stories and details are missing from the published Book of Mormon. While we can't recover all these narratives and details, we do know that the earliest and lost Book of Mormon manuscript offered far more narrative detail regarding Lehi and his sojourn, as well as the first 4.5 centuries of Nephite history, than does the small plates accounts. How can we know this? We can still see evidence and references to details that were in the lost narrative. These clues reside in 3 realms of primary source material. 1. Large-scale characterizations of the lost manuscript. 2. References within the published text. And 3. Historical recollections alluding to the lost pages. As discussed in Chapter 5, our best available evidence suggests that the lost manuscript was considerably longer than the traditional count of 116 pages. However, even at only 116 pages, it would have had finer narrative detail than contained in the small plates accounts, due to the latter's inclusion of the lengthy prophecies, doctrinal exposition, and biblical quotations. Since these non-narrative elements make up much of the small plates, a comparable-sized lost manuscript that omitted such elements would contain much more narrative than the replacement text. The lost manuscript would then likely provide several times the detail on early Nephite history than we now possess in the extant text. And given that our evidence points to that manuscript being significantly longer than 116 pages, it would have offered a specificity and richness of detail many times over that the present text does for 4.5 centuries of Nephite history. And given that the lost manuscript was characterized as more Hebraic and based off the dynastically linked large plates, it would particularly have offered greater detail on certain themes, such as those linked with the kings in Nephite's dynasty and Hebraic themes like temple, lineage, and observance of Jewish festivals. References within our Book of Mormon. Many passages in our published Book of Mormon contain contextual clues or references to material that is now missing, but was once there. For example, in Alma 10, we are told by Amulek that he is a descendant of Aminadai, who interpreted the writing which was upon the wall of the temple, which was written by the finger of God. That's verse 2. The way that Mormon shares this account without providing additional information on Aminadai implies that the reader would have already been made aware of this story. By following such clues further to where they lead and cross-referencing them with other texts and clues, we can connect the dots between references to see the outlines of the missing information. For more on Aminadai and the writings on the wall, see Chapter 13. Woohoo! So it looks like it's coming. Historical recollections alluding to the lost pages. In addition to large-scale characterizations of the lost manuscript and references within the published Book of Mormon, there are contemporary documents, such as the May 1829 Revelation published as Doctrine and Covenants 10, and later recollections that point to the content in the lost manuscript. A few recollections utilized in this book are those of Fayette Lapham, Amer Harris, and Francis Gladden Bishop, all of which have already been quoted in previous chapters concerning this information on both the translation of the golden plates and the physical manuscript pages. Their comments on the content of the Book of Mormon provide clues to what close insiders to Joseph Smith Sr. and Martin Harris said about the narratives in the lost pages. For example, Lapham reports that Nephi's killing of Laban and the acquisition of the brass plates occurring during a great feast, a detail that is not explicitly given by Nephi in his small plates account. See Fayette Lapham interview with the father of Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, 40 years ago, his account of the finding of the sacred plates. Given that the challenges of the time and memory, such details should not be accepted without scrutiny by checking them against the broader structural aspects of the Book of Mormon and references within it, we can not only gauge the reliability of the recollected details, we can sharpen those details and discover further insights into the lost manuscript. Thus, as will be shown in the following chapter, by examining Lapham's account of a feast in light of the Hebraic emphasis of the missing pages, and refers with let me start over on that. Thus, as will be shown in the following chapter, by examining Lapham's account of a feast in light of Hebraic emphasis on the missing pages, and references within Nephi's small plates account, we can surmise that Laban's drunkenness on the night that Nephi snuck into Jerusalem to acquire the brass plates was connected to the celebration of the Jewish Passover, a festival that both looked back on the Israelites' exodus from Egypt toward their promised land in Canaan, and launched the Lehites' exodus from Jerusalem toward their own promised land in the Americas. Although the very first translation of Mormon's abridgment from the Nephite record has been missing for nearly 2 centuries, examining large-scale features of the lost manuscript, including its length and Hebraic emphasis, references contained in both small plates and accounts of Mormon's writings and later recollections can provide us with numerous pieces that we can put together as we seek to reconstruct the Book of Mormon's missing stories. Next is Chapter 7, a Passover setting for Lehi's Exodus. Oh, it's getting good. Again, I'm always at amazement with how he constructs what he's trying to do. And there's a few things, like when he gets to the specifics that are just mind-blowing, like he really sets up his stuff well. Different main points, like, again, like I was blown away by his description of the Urim and Thummim and what it probably looked like and how it was used. I never knew that stuff before. The information about what the pages looked like, the length of the missing pages, all good stuff. And now, next is going to be Passover setting. And then, Lehi's tabernacle in the wilderness will be after that. The 7 tribes of Lehi. Oh, interesting. Nephi's conquest. Oh, God. So these next several chapters are all about reconstructing what was likely in there and under the pages that he talked about. The lost middle period. God and Amenidi's in the temple. Sorry, I'm excited. Well, today I get to go into work now that it's a new year and clean up all the messes that were left by the end of the year by whatever sources from my companies. Love you lots, Dad. Enjoy your day. We'll see you.